I'm going to start by making a very, very broad statement, and then we can obviously get into the details of the implications. The alignment of issues and forces for the United States interest in the Middle East today are generally rather favorable. In fact, I would say certainly when compared to the last 6 to 12 months, but I think I could also say in a generation, which really represents something historic. However, and of course, whenever you speak of the Middle East, there is always a however, often in caps and underscored. This is a time of dramatic and even convulsive change in the Middle East. Uh, uh, and U.S. allies and our partners in that region face heightened risks because of the nature of the changes that are underway right now. Middle East has shown itself to be a region of inherent instability and unpredictability, with political mood swings and often impulsive decision making without regard to strategy or considerations of second and third order effects. Moreover, it's the home to populations who are largely dissatisfied with their governments and their living conditions and feel powerless to change them. It's a region that's prone to external interference for strictly national self interest without regard to either regional or global instability. So, while I posited that conditions are generally more favorable to the United States and our interest in this part of the world at the moment, I do not mean to. I don't want to suggest that we can either turn our backs on this part of the world, or certainly ignore the very important events that are taking place. And also keeping mindful of the fact that crises in this part of the world are frequent and can often occur overnight. With regard to the American role, and I'm speaking as a result of my own experience living and working in the Middle East for nearly 20 years. Um, it's a place where American ambitions and aspirations go to die. The record of our involvement in the Middle East is a checkered one, and we have to be mindful of that as we move forward in this very uncertain period.
What is the aftermath of the October 7th Hamas invasion of Israel and the subsequent actions by Israel to destroy Hamas? What's that effect of those actions on the region?
In responding, I will first have to qualify my statement by saying it really depends on where you're sitting, whether you're in Jerusalem or in Washington, in Gaza itself, or in southern Lebanon, and we can go on because the perspectives are different. The upshot is, and this accounts for the dramatic changes that we've seen in the last 6 months, is that the forces that have been largely aligned, most certainly against Israel, but also against the United States, are very much weakened. And I think to the point that those particular parties, the so-called axis of resistance, as Iran likes to refer to its network of proxies, um, they underestimated the power of Israel's response and the impact, and they overestimated their own capabilities. And so, as a result of that, they made some colossal mistakes, strategic mistakes, and are now paying the price for that. We are seeing the sorts of things that we have been pining for, working for decades, now come to the fore simply because these particular countries or organizations, groups, terrorist groups in many cases, do not possess the kind of power they once thought they had.
I may comment and add on to that. I would say Iran has spent the better part of 30 years developing this axis of resistance, their proxy network, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And the degradation of that entire network now limits the ability of Iran to project military power in an asymmetric way, which was always kind of below the waterline. They're proxies. It's really not us. And it keeps them off of the viewfinder or the HUD of American military power. Now, because of the limitations that they have post 7 October, I believe that that means they have to rely, if they want to project power, on more conventional means, which is their missile force, their growing drone capability. They just built a drone carrier, which obviously is going to complicate naval operations in the Arabian Gulf. Um, and their nascent nuclear capabilities, which may make it more likely that they would go nuclear because of they don't have the conventional power to resist forces, Israel or the United States in the region, which may make them want to have that trump card to diplomatically have to punch above their weight, if you will. That's just my comments on your comment, but from a military perspective.
And you're absolutely right. And even Iran's vaunted ballistic missile force, which was sort of the second line of defense after this alignment of proxy groups, has been dealt a very severe blow by Israel in its October attacks. Um, I've seen estimates ranging from half to two-thirds of the ballistic missile force has been destroyed, and the facilities that the Iranians use for the manufacture of these ballistic missiles has suffered considerable damage and in some cases complete destruction. So they are really feeling vulnerable at the moment, and I think there's some appreciation for that on the part of the Trump administration now, who sees perhaps an opportunity, and we've heard some indications from that, but nothing very clear that perhaps we could enter into a more substantive negotiation to limit Iran's nuclear weapons program. And we can get into a discussion about that and what it might look like, but that's very tenuous at the moment. Neither side has really put something that's very clear and concise forward, and therefore it remains to be seen whether that is a genuine option that might be pursued.
What is your read on the viability of our administration's plans for Gaza, particularly the population evacuating to Egypt, Jordan, or some third country?
Uh, Moving the population of Gaza outside of Gaza would be the most convulsive event we will have witnessed in the Middle East since the end of World War II. The two countries mentioned by President Trump as destinations for the Gazans, Jordan and Egypt, are adamantly opposed for very real domestic, political, and economic reasons to this. Moreover, every Arab country has expressed its pretty strong opposition to the movement of Gazans outside of the Gaza Strip. And the logistics of moving them is something else. I don't think either Israeli military forces or certainly American military forces want to be involved in an exercise in which we're, and this is going to have to be forcibly rounding up
Right.
Palestinians and transporting them to some place they don't want to go and where they're not welcome. And then there's the whole idea of, well, we still have the problem of Hamas. Although Hamas has suffered major damage as a result of this war, and is nowhere near the organization that it was on October 7th, it still presents a threat to Israeli forces. And if the United States were foolish enough to put our own forces there, to our own forces. So there are some real problems to this suggestion. However, I'm not sure that was President Trump's intention all along. I think, and we can argue about whether this was the right way to do it. He finally wanted to deliver a real jolt to Middle Eastern countries that this is a problem that they need to embrace and that they need to look at constructive ways for addressing not only the problem of Gaza itself, which is a major problem, but the stability of their region going forward, and not sit on the sidelines as they have largely and kibitz when the United States or someone else decides to make a policy change that has an impact on them. And we are seeing that. There was a meeting in Cairo very recently. There's another one scheduled in Riyadh, I think next week. And so, if that was his intention, then it's had his desired effect. We are seeing all of these countries take the kind of initiative which, quite frankly, they should have been doing decades ago.
Why do Middle East countries ruled by royal families appear to exhibit more stability than those countries in the region that do not have such leadership arrangements?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there are a couple of reasons why. They enjoy the kind of legitimacy that many, of course, we're excluding Israel here. It's really not part of this conversation. But with respect to the Arab countries, um, uh, uh, those ruled by monarchies um, generally enjoy legitimacy, whereas the others do not. There's no government that has been democratically elected. There had been in Tunisia, and we had entertained hopes that we might have a genuine Arab democracy, but that situation has now degenerated to the default of the Middle East, which is an autocracy. But in the case of the monarchies, there is a tradition in every single one of the countries that's ruled by a monarchy of accepting and embracing the monarchy. And monarchies are generally a bit more responsive. Now, they're not democracies, and they are just as prone as the non monarchies of the region to clamp down with very oppressive measures when anyone appears to stand up in opposition or to vocally criticize and certainly embarrass the leadership. But for the most part, as I said, they enjoy the kind of legitimacy that some of the other countries, like the North African countries, Morocco excluded, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and others. And as long as that continues, and I think it will, they will generally remain stable. They tend to have more prosperous economies. Of course, most of them are oil economies, and for the time being, oil economies are going to do well. Uh, Morocco is and Jordan are the two outsiders. Morocco has a fairly extensive trade network. They have the kind of natural resources that facilitates it. They're close to Europe, which helps enormously. The real problematic monarchy right now is Jordan, as it faces some pretty severe economic challenges right now, and it's one of the reasons why King Abdullah has voiced his concerns personally to President Trump about this Gaza proposal. Many of the wealthier Arab countries have indicated a willingness to um, to bankroll reconstruction in Gaza, and I'm thinking primarily of the Gulf countries and a handful of others. There are even a smaller number of countries who are willing to provide security in the Gaza Strip once the war is officially declared over and the fighting has stopped, and we're certainly not at that point yet. But the real question remains. Well, there are two questions that remain, and the first is um, what to do about Hamas. As I mentioned, they're still there, and they still present a threat to any outside force. And then the second question, and this is the enduring question of the Middle East, dating back to the end of World War II and even before, and that is what to do about Palestinian aspirations for an independent state. And all of these countries who have stepped forward and saying they're willing to either bankroll reconstruction or perhaps lend some security to the Gaza Strip have all indicated the one um, uh, condition that they're not willing to consider, and that is that there's a clear path established for Palestinian statehood. And the clearest obstacle to that, of course, is Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu's unwillingness to even consider the proposition at the moment. In fact, that's been his standing position throughout his political life, and I don't foresee that changing in the foreseeable future. And so we really have a major impediment to the reconstruction of Gaza. And for that reason, it's a very unsettled question. It's very unclear. The United States would play a role. Whether we would commit resources or not is a question for Congress. There are a lot of reasons why I can think that Americans would not want to do it. There are others, on the other hand, who think it's part of our responsibility in the Middle East in forging ahead toward uh, a more peaceful Middle East. So it's not really clear what role the United States would play. If you're talking about Arab peoples throughout the Middle East and Muslims speaking even more broadly, um, what I like to refer to as the Arab Street is overwhelmingly supportive of Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. Arab governments um, have a bit more nuanced position when it comes to the Palestinians. With regard to providing financial assistance, for example, at one time they were major financial backers of the Palestinian Authority. When I served as head of mission of the Middle East Quartet in Jerusalem, I usually did my tin cup exercise and traveled, especially to the Gulf, to meet with the leaderships in those countries about their funding considerations. And I was noticing back then, and this was about 10 or 12 years ago, that they were becoming increasingly hesitant to write more checks because of the inherent corruption in the Palestinian Authority, which I could not argue with. I had personal experience dealing with the corruption in the Palestinian Authority. Um, and there's not a single Palestinian, either in the West Bank or in Gaza, who would argue otherwise. It's rife with corruption from the very top on down. So there's a lack of trust in the leadership. There is no love lost whatsoever for Hamas among Arab governments. Arab governments detest Hamas nearly as much as Israel, I have to say. And there are some, again, nuanced exceptions, Qatar, and to also an extent, Turkey, which I really don't consider an Arab country. In fact, it's not. Um, and then there's a third factor, and that's history. When you look at the history of Palestinians who have been forced out of either Gaza or the West Bank to neighboring countries, it's not a good one. In 1980, the Palestinian Liberation Organization had taken up residence in Jordan and almost had established a mini state to the point that Israeli or Jordanian security and military forces had no-go zones because of the threat of attack from the Palestinian forces associated with the PLO. And King Hussein finally realized that he was losing control of his country, and he mounted a major military campaign, which now is known as Black September, in September of 1980 or the 1981. And it was pretty violent. He sent in tanks. He had aircraft. Um, I think it's well known today, but was kept quite secret at the time. King Hussein had reached out to the United States and asked us to reach out to the Israelis to provide potential air cover in the event that another military force, he was particularly concerned about Syria, might intervene on behalf of the Palestinians. In the end, they did not. But the PLO Palestinians were violently expelled from Jordan, and took up residence in southern Lebanon. And it did not take them long to spark what became a very violent, destructive 15-year civil war in southern Lebanon. If we fast forward to Kuwait in 1990 and the invasion of Iraqi forces of Kuwait, Yasser Arafat had expressed support for Saddam Hussein, and Palestinians in Kuwait were demonstrating in the streets in favor of the Iraqi troops. To this day, Kuwaitis have not forgotten that. So the legacy of Palestinians in other countries, I certainly don't mean to speak um, categorically, but the history of Palestinians taking up residence in other countries um, is not a good one, and that's generally why they have not been particularly welcome in large numbers, and one of the reasons accounting for the unwillingness of any Arab state to accept them. They're also concerned about the fact that were Gazans to be expelled from Gaza, they would be unable to return.
As U.S. policies rapidly evolve with our administration changes, to such entities as CENTCOM and their developed relationships help to maintain a constant in the region. The role of the COCOM in both the military and diplomatic sphere in the region as U.S. policies and maybe U.S. footprint changes in the region is helpful, hurtful, neutral, what have you.
My understanding of COCOM may be different. Uh, the COCOM that I'm familiar with was an organization established among Western developed countries to prevent um, um, technology being
Yeah, I think
transferred.
yeah, what he means is the combatant command. So
Oh, the combatant commands. Oh,
yes. So
well, I
CENTCOM
mean,
as the combatant command and the combatant commander and his relationships with both civilian and military leaders in the region. Is that helpful, hurtful as a constant stabilizing factor?
oh, well, at least in my own personal experience dealing with Central Command, I'd say it's extremely helpful. During my time serving in the Middle East, the Central Command commander would generally tour the various parts of the Middle East a couple of times a year, and their visits were always welcome. And the interactions that they would have, not just with the military leadership, but also with the political leadership, the heads of state, were very constructive. Bear in mind that this occurred during periods of obviously pretty heightened security concerns, whether it was a terrorism threat, the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, or various intifadas that occurred in the West Bank, Gaza, and in Israel. So I think it's important, it's essential actually to our broader relationship with these countries. That in conjunction with the role of the Secretary of Defense, that's been very important. Then, of course, on the diplomatic side, Secretary of State, and down to the levels of the ambassadors. The Central Command commander doesn't have anything like ambassadors who are personal representatives of the president in each of the countries who also can interact with the senior leaderships. And so those two work together extremely closely. I worked very, very closely with my Central Command colleagues, and there's a great deal of cooperation between us.
That's always been my experience. I was never stationed at CENTCOM. I always was deployed in the area of the Middle East. But I have a question that says, for me, it says, do you think we'll maintain our current military footprint in the region? That's a great question. From my last 3 years in uniform, I can tell you that we were trying to, you can call it a pivot, an adjustment, but trying to move forces from EUCOM, European Command, Central Command, into the Indo-Pacific and heighten or increase the American military footprint in the Western Pacific, particularly. I can tell you, and I tell people this all the time, when I joined the military in 1987, we had 20 active Army divisions. We had 600 ship Navy, almost 5,000 fighter attack aircraft, 300 bombers. The Marine Corps was 200,000 plus. And so there was a lot more force structure to spread around the globe. What we have today with an 8 division Army, 170,000 person Marine Corps, 270 ships, only 40% of them work. We don't have the assets to cover the globe like we used to. So hard choices have to be made. What I can tell you is some of the most sticky conversations in the tank in my 3 years as the G35 of the Marine Corps evolved around assets in CENTCOM. And depending on situations, when Iran would get a little feisty and you wanted to move additional resources into the area, particularly anti-ballistic missile resources, the question was, okay, where are they coming from? And you also have a significant ballistic missile threat in the first island chain in places like Guam, Philippines, Okinawa, mainland Japan. Like, you want to protect those areas too. So particularly with the Navy and our ballistic missile destroyers, DDGs, not every one of them has that capability, but the ones who do are on picket duty around North Korea, and in areas in the Miyako and Luzon Strait. And to move them to the Persian Gulf, you can do it, but now you have less capability there. We are really, and the American people need to know this, we're a one MRC, major regional contingency military. Like, we can fight one war at a time with the resources we currently have. We'll do the best we can to deter everywhere else, but it's not like it was in the late 80s or early 90s before the quote unquote peace dividend after the first Gulf War. So, I would say we're going to try to move military resources out of the Middle East for the Pacific. That would be, I think, our strategy intent. However, as you said, the Middle East has a however underlined. We've never been able to do it because there are things that happen in the Middle East that prevent a lot of those force structure savings or movements to occur. And so that's how I'd answer that question. Probably the intent of the strategy is yes. In actuality, I think it becomes more difficult to do.
Just to add a point in your argument there, General, just as the level of our armed forces is nowhere near what it was when you joined the Marine Corps or when I served in the Air Force, our defense industrial base
Yes.
is considerably reduced. We cannot produce the numbers of ships, aircraft, artillery shells, and bullets and weapons that we did during those earlier periods. We just don't have the capacity to do it. Now, I think at some point the Biden administration had begun to ramp that up, but you don't reach the point where we were, say, in the late 80s or early 90s in a period of a few years. It will probably take a decade, which means a lot of budget investment in the defense industrial base just to give us the wherewithal to fight that one contingency that you referred to.
Yeah, to that point, sir. I mean, in the late 80s and early 90s, the United States had 60 shipyards that made naval ships. Today we have 6. So the throughput, the ability to generate and then maintain a 400 ship Navy. We've had different numbers over the years. Is it 340, 355? Is it 400? What's the right amount of ships in the Navy? And the bottom line is it would take us probably 20 years to generate that, given the current industrial base. To your point of 155 artillery shells, Not a very high-tech piece of equipment, but in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, when they ran out of ammunition fairly quickly, they were shooting 155 projectiles. What the United States industrial base made in a month, they were shooting that every 3 days. And so modern war against peer, semi-peer, it has puts a huge strain on munitions. And we are globally challenged in things like TLAMs, SM6s, that are at the top of every combatant commander's, how many do I have? Where are they? If peace, um, if we're not able to maintain the peace, that those weapons are very desired by the combatant commanders. We probably have in a peer-on-peer fight 30 to 45 days stockages of those weapons. So again, it takes about 3 to 5 years to ramp up production in any one line, to your point. So let me get back to some of the chat questions here. Um, do you think it will be possible to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear bomb without direct military action by Israel or the United States?
Well, the latter is certainly very, very possible, and I have no doubt that the topic was discussed at some length when Prime Minister Netanyahu met with President Trump. I guess now is a couple of weeks ago. Um, I think there is a possibility of undertaking diplomatic negotiations, largely because of the vulnerability that Iran has been exposed to as a result of the Israeli attacks against Iran. And I really can't overstate enough the importance of that. Those attacks were were very damaging, not only to the real defenses of Iran itself, but to their perception of the strength of their defenses. So they've almost suffered a double defeat, and they understand now that they are so exposed, they may be, I want to underscore that, more willing to negotiate. And so it's incumbent on, well, them to show an interest, and they're not showing much of one, and it's sort of they're a bit schizophrenic about it. We hear positive indications from the president of Iran, who does not have the final decision power, and less encouraging statements coming from the supreme leader in Iran. And so I still think there's some possibility. I don't know whether there's been any communication between our government and the Iranians. We do have ways of communicating, even though we don't have diplomatic ties. And so that exists. And the other factor I'll toss in there is that President Trump, the one consistent position I think we can probably agree on is he does not like wars. He understands what the cost of war is, and he'll look for ways to avoid if he can. And therefore, if there is a possibility of a genuine negotiation that leads to an enforceable um, uh, uh, constraints, enforceable constraints on Iran's nuclear weapons program, I think he might try to pursue it. If not, then we're looking at that second option. But the window on that is probably going to close. I won't. I don't know how soon, but they won't remain exposed for very long.
I think that's my read on it, sir, is that sometimes when nations feel most threatened, and I'll go back to, I think it was the comment that the president of India made when somebody asked him about the first Gulf War was, what lessons do you draw from Gulf War One? He said, don't fight America without a nuclear weapon. And I think a lot of countries took that view because you get treated differently, and it limits U.S. options if you're talking about fighting someone with that kind of capability. This vulnerable period in their time when they've lost their proxy forces, there could be a decision to say, we need that weapon now, or we're so vulnerable we won't be able to protect ourselves. It, I mean, how they go, I don't think anybody is a good prognosticator of Iranian actions just because of the way their government is structured, but it could end up that way. That's the thing that concerns me when I look at it. And then another part of the question was, what do you think about proliferation of that capability throughout the region once that genie's out of the bottle? I mean, once the Iranians have a nuclear capability, what does the region look like, and who else then rushes to possess such weapons?
Um, the uh, the vulnerability that they face is the Israelis were able to launch this attack back in October, and it was actually two separate attacks by F-35s, and they didn't lose a single aircraft, not a single one. And quite a few aircraft were involved with some of these aircraft flying multiple sorties. And so they've lost their radar system. And as we said before, they've lost a significant number of their ballistic missiles. And they understand now that even another attack by Israel, this time focused on their nuclear weapons infrastructure, would be devastating. If the Americans were to join the Israelis in such an attack, it would probably set the nuclear weapons program back. I really can't say. I don't have the intelligence to know, but it would set it back considerably. So that's something they're going to have to weigh. On the other hand, an attack by Israel, especially if it were joined by the United States, would move this conflict into an entirely different realm. This would be an open war between Iran and Israel, and potentially even the United States. And as you just indicated, this is a part of the world where we'd like to extricate ourselves and focus on more existential threats to the United States. So we're not interested in getting drawn into the kind of war that would bog us down. And certainly a war with Iran would be like that. This is a country of 85 million people, very capable technologically, despite all the sanctions that have imposed on them. So there would be costs to bear for launching a war of this kind. Uh, that's despite the fact that it may come down to that if Israel feels threatened by the progress the Iranians are making on their nuclear weapons program, and we all know that the Iranians now have the technology to do that within a matter of days, if not weeks.
The other thing that I would add to that is you can't be certain that, the Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran have really formed a loose community of a learning and adaptability community. So from what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, they're sharing those lessons learned with North Korea, China, Iran, and some of it's not just technological sharing, it's tactical and technique sharing that will make them a more formidable military, because there's nothing like uh, learning about war. You can learn it about, by reading books, but you learn the best when you're actually doing it and your life's on the line, because it tends to focus one's mind. So I think that's happening now in the region. Um, we have
I would just
another.
add just a final comment, and that is that if war against Iran were to take place, an attack, we don't know what the responses from our adversaries, our existential adversaries, Russia and China and others would be. We just don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of intelligence estimates out there and could give us options, but we don't know. And those are things that also need to be factored in.
No, that's true, because Iran has been very helpful to Russia they've given them a lot of drones. They're actually building a factory there to produce them closer to the battlefield to cut down on shipping costs and time. And so there's a bit, we are, we call them the 4+1, one being international terrorism, but that entity has been working together far more frequently and deeply than we probably thought possible maybe 2 to 3 years ago. So, um, one more, there's a question about Lebanon and the new regime there. And are you hopeful that that regime will, I guess it's from, where is it? Joseph, uh, I've lost the damn question now. uh, Joseph Aoun and his new cabinet and the diminished influence of Hezbollah, are you hopeful for Lebanon in the future?
I'm hopeful at the moment. Um, um, it's important to take a moment to talk about what Hezbollah has suffered as a result of the conflict last fall, the out and out combat between Hezbollah and Israeli Defense Forces. And you really have to tip your hat to the Israelis for the incredible intelligence work that was done to go after the Hezbollah leadership. They have eliminated not just a very, very top leader, Nasser Nasrallah, or Hassan Nasrallah, who was an incomparable figure, and there's no one there now who can replace him. Moreover, the Israelis took out the second and third levels of the leadership, including a lot of the military leadership of Hezbollah. And they have probably eliminated a third to half of Hezbollah fighters, and I'd say close to two-thirds of the Hezbollah's missiles and drones. So it's a really devastating defeat for Hezbollah. And on top of that, of course, um, its main conduit for weapons and materiel from Iran used to come through Syria. That can't happen anymore because that has been shut down after the fall of the Assad regime back in December. And so they are literally cut off from their life machine, their life support. And it's hard for me to imagine how they're going to continue. I'll also add with regard to Syria that Hezbollah was capitalizing on Syria's manufacture and distribution of Captagon, which is comparable to methamphetamine here in the United States. It's a drug. It's been around since World War II. It was initially developed by the Germans. In fact, there are indications that maybe it was used by Nazi troops in some areas of combat. Syria was a major producer, the major producer of Captagon, and was supporting itself and also providing some support to Hezbollah as a result of that trade. That has been stopped. Excuse me. And so Hezbollah has suffered these losses, and now the non-Hezbollah Hezbollah political factions within Lebanon are trying to rally, unite, and come together to truly take charge finally of the Lebanese government. And I'm hopeful. Aoun and his prime minister have shown commitment to want to do this, to shore up an economy that's was on its back. Had been one of the most successful economies throughout the Middle East without oil, and it was on its back. The country was in political disarray, hadn't had a president in 2 years, and they have asserted right from the top that they are going to send Lebanese military, the actual armed forces of Lebanon, into southern Lebanon for the first time in probably more than 20 years. And they are taking control of southern Lebanon, and they want to see Hezbollah disarmed. Now, that's going to be a chore. And this is where I think countries like the United States and France, who have shown the most interest in and commitment to Lebanon, need to step forward and provide the kind of support that the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese government and President Aoun are going to need in order to assert control throughout their country. Now, there is one obstacle, and that is Hezbollah still has a significant number of seats in the Lebanese parliament. I can't remember the actual number, but it's something on the order of something like 30 to 40% of the seats, so it's not a majority. And what the other political factions are going to have to do is come together to ensure that Hezbollah cannot assert the political influence it once had in the Lebanese parliament. And that's going to be difficult because there are a couple of political parties who have shown a willingness to ally themselves with Hezbollah in the past. Now, those may have been alliances of convenience for the time. Things have changed considerably, but it's going to take a lot of political work by now President Aoun in seizing control of his country and putting it on a proper track.